Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar Threat Intel Analysis and its Influences on Hunt Team Operations and SAR by our speaker Randy Thomas and Bryan Austin. I'm Shilpa Goswami and I'll be your host for the day. Before we get started, we would like to go over a few house rules. For our attendees, the session will be in listen-only mode and will last for an hour, out of which last 10 minutes will be dedicated to Q&A. If you have any questions during the webinar to organizers or our speakers, use the Q&A window. Also, if you face any audio-video challenges, please check your internet connections or you may log out and log in again. An important announcement for our audiences. We have initiated CPE credit certificates for our participants, and to qualify for one, attendees are required to attend the entire webinar and then send an email to cybertalks@ecouncil.org, after which our team will issue the CPE certificates. Also, we would like to announce our audiences about the special handouts by taking the screenshot of the running webinar and post in your social media, LinkedIn or Twitter, tagging EC Council and Cyber Talks. We will share the free handouts for two first 10 audiences. As a commitment to closing the cybersecurity workforce gap by creating multi-domain cyber technician, EC Council pledges $3.5 million towards CCT education and certification scholarship to certify approximately 10,000 cyber professionals ready to contribute to the industry.
Did you know that you can be part of the lucrative cybersecurity industry? Even top companies like Google, Microsoft, Amazon, IBM, Facebook, and Dell all hire cybersecurity professionals. The cybersecurity industry has a 0% unemployment rate. The average salary for an entry-level cybersecurity job is about $100,000 per year in the United States. Furthermore, you don't need to know coding and learn from your home, and you get a scholarship to kickstart your career. Apply now. EC Council is pledging a $3.5 million CCT scholarship for cybersecurity career starters. Scan the QR code on the screen to apply for the scholarship. Fill out the form.
In the chat section. Our speaker for today's session, Randy Thomas. Randy is responsible for the SOC, Security Product Development, which includes detection as code, DIFR, incident command, vulnerability management, threat intelligence-driven security operations, threat hunting, and offensive security at Syntex, a leading managed cloud provider. Randy has over 21 years of experience in enterprise cybersecurity and various environments, including the US military and intelligence for commercial e-com, retail, and MSSP markets. He leverages his combined 28 plus years of enterprises IT experience and 18 years of experience in DevOps, DevSecOps, SOC, security engineering, and software development to deliver high quality security products and solutions. Our second speaker for the day, Bryan Austin. Bryan is the manager of security operations at Syntex. He heads up the development of operational maturity, threat intelligence, automation, threat analysis, and incident response. Bryan has over 20 years of cybersecurity and IT experience in organizations ranging from MSSP to retail and finance organization. As a security operation manager, Bryan coordinates response and active hunts in multiple large organizations. He coordinates with teams worldwide to ensure customers and the organizers manage risk effectively. Without any further delay, I would hand over the session to you, Randy and Bryan.
Thank you, Shilpa, and thank you everyone for attending and for later watching the recording. So here is the agenda for our talk today. A focus on threat hunting, how that works with cyber threat intel, and how you develop use cases, how that works across the life cycle, and how you can do automations and do measurements of effectiveness. So as Shilpa has already introduced us, we'll save this for later and we will get stuck into the conversation. So what is threat hunting? And Bryan and I have done this together for years with many customers. And really the main point is it's a proactive process that you go through to look for bad guys, to look for indicators of compromise, and you have to have some level of threat intelligence work, some known tactics, techniques, procedures to be able to do this. And Bryan will go through some more of the benefits of that now.
Yeah, so as Randy said, that threat hunting is essentially analysis in reverse. It's incident response in reverse. So rather than waiting for the incident to come to you, you go ahead and assume that there is a breach. And it's that defense first mentality that allows you to go through your environment backwards, looking for adversarial activity. And we'll go through a little bit more about what that is involved with, but the big things that you're looking for are to identify gaps in your visibility so that you can effectively respond to real threats that your organization is facing. You're looking also for gaps in any of your detection and compensating controls. So anytime that there is an adversary moving through the environment, you're able to have those defense forward postures. Things like honey tokens or good indicators based on what type of activity you're expecting to see from adversaries. So additionally, you're looking to build tools that will help close those gaps. A good wall is only as good as its weakest point. So in identifying these weaknesses, you're able to start firming them up with the appropriate tools and technologies based on some of the frameworks and tools that we're going to be talking about a little bit later here. Another point is you want to uncover new threats and tools, tactics, and processes which can feed back into the threat intelligence process, but also it will help inform your analysis and your forensics and incident response procedures so that it makes your team faster, cleaner, more efficient, and able to automate so that you're able to reduce your time to respond and reduce adversarial time to penetrate your network and cause issues and disruptions. The last is to identify recommendations for best practices. So this gives you the opportunity to work backwards through your environment, and it gives you a talking point to begin coordinating with the other IT organizations inside of your company. So these will help you to develop a better secure posture, but it's also going to open you up to working with other teams to help coordinate with them, help them achieve their goals, and by that, help them to become security advocates in your organization.
Great points, Bryan. You know, and some of you might be wondering, well, who does threat hunting? You know, how can I do threat hunting if I am in security operations or if I want to get into security operations? So, and that varies from organization to organization. It's very much a part of incident response work. So if you're a tier 1 SOC analyst, you typically get involved in incident handling. You may not be primarily responsible for incident response. You may get tasking requests from other colleagues on the team, but there's a place for threat hunting throughout an organization, even if it does not have a component that's their full-time job. So there's lots of aspects of that. So just keep that in mind as we go forward during the presentation.
And
So
a tier 1 analyst absolutely can be a threat hunter.
yes,
It's all
absolutely.
about using the tools.
Yeah, that really comes into a lot of staffing in a security operations environment, whether it's a SOC analyst or if it's an incident responder at a higher tier. It's really having that analytic mindset and being able to, use their backgrounds, their skills to be able to effectively defend in that environment. So going further into threat hunting, so we prescribe to the TAHITI methodology, which is an interesting acronym and would be a difficult one to make. But with that being said, Bryan, if you want to go through the major components of that.
Yeah, so there are 3 major types of threat hunting that you see done predominantly. There's the Tahiti methodology, there's IOC methodology, and there's hypothesis-based. So we're going to kind of walk through all 3 of those, but the one that we are personally the most fond of is the Tahiti. So it's targeted hunting, integrating threat intelligence. So this is a very proactive model, and it focuses in on tools, tactics, and processes used by adversaries based on threat models and profiles of actors as well as organizations to help narrow down scopes. So you start out and some of the observable indicators that you work with would be considered IOCs. Now, IOCs can be specific information, file hashes, IP addresses, domain names. A newer one that is really coming into vogue in proactive hunting is JARM hashes. I got to give a talk a while back when I was working in a finance organization, and we had used JARM hashes as well as domain signatures for how the actor was registering domains and SSL certificates to actually proactively track adversarial activity targeting our organization and stopping it before it was able to be weaponized. So it was really a neat thing. But IOCs are great tools to start working with. You can reference them as atomic indicators because they are like the lowest point in the attack chain that you can observe. They're usually on that pyramid of pain. It's that bottom realm. They're almost arbitrary. They're easy to target. But those IOCs then lead back into more techniques, more tactics, if you can chain them together and start working backwards from that. And that leads you into a proactive threat detection. So as you go in and you search for these indicators, you start looking for not just the indicators, but also the way that the tools are being used. Specific chains of how a command is run can actually tell you a lot about an actor. And as you read through some of the newer intel reports, you'll see a lot of that information. And that can help inform how your organization looks at the analysis and begins to move backwards through that chain to track it out. Now, all of this is great because as you're building these profiles, as you're building these comprehensive understandings of how to do the threat detection, what IOCs this actor uses, it can help inform the incident response team. And the incident response team is going to be helped because now, as they find one indicator, they now know most likely based on these patterns, it's going to be this type of actor who likes to use this type of kill chain. So being able to narrow that scope can speed response time. It can lower your time to remediation and your time to containment, which is absolutely the name of the game. We've had a customer tell us a few times very recently that a particular vendor has released a statement saying that the mean time from beginning of attack in BEC to actual compromise and exploitation is 23 minutes. That is a very narrow window of time. And as the actor gets into that system, especially with highly organized actors, it gets passed through multiple levels. But that happens very, very rapidly. So we want to be able to respond in real time nearly to make sure that we're covering what needs to be done. Additionally, because a lot of actors, they're like developers and they're like all of us. When we find something that works for us, we want to just continue to use it. It's easy to remember. We build those pathways and they're easy to keep traveling. We don't want to trailblaze something new and try to do something different if we know what works. So a lot of these actors will continue to use the same methodology over and over and over again. So by following through with that from an intelligence perspective and handing it off to the IR team, they're able to follow those pathways and you can start getting ahead of the actor rather than being responsive. You now get to be proactive, which is fantastic. And all of that,
Absolutely.
yeah. And Randy and I have worked together for many years in a few different positions. And the big thing of it is the threat intelligence utilization. So
Yep.
all of it chains together from a good intelligence pipeline and having the right data fed to the right people and processed the right way. There's a dozen different tools out there that are fantastic. Some of them are open source and free and require just the engineering perspective and the hosting. Some of them cost money, but each one of them generates its own value.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely. So,
so
what you'll
Randy,
see
sorry,
as
go
we
ahead.
go forward in the conversation later, we'll talk about the life cycle and well, how do you incorporate this? This is proactive. It takes more work up front, so you want to iterate on it. As we get into the next couple of major methodologies that Bryan mentioned earlier, some of those are more responsive or reactive. So, anything
Uh,
else you want to talk on Tahiti, Bryan?
well, something that you mentioned, I grew up on a farm, as if you couldn't tell from the hat. I actually have a small farm here, and something that my dad told me, and I tell my kids, you can work really hard up front and then relax because it's just maintenance, or
Mhm.
you can try to push it around and then work really, really hard when the time comes. So I personally like to have all of my work done on the front end. So by building these things, it is a challenge to build these continuous monitoring platforms and pathways. But once you do it, it makes and simplifies problems down the road. And if you can, the old saying is, an ounce of prevention is worth a ton of cure. So
Yeah,
building
well
these,
said.
yeah, building these paths are, it's absolutely fantastic. It's going to reduce your friction later on.
So let's go into more responsive and reactive methodologies here. So IOC based. So hopefully everyone knows what an IOC is. It's an atomic indicator, it's an IP address, it's a file hash, it's a FQDN, it's things like that. So anything you want to speak to in particular here, Bryan?
Yeah, so IOCs are great, especially if they come from a what we would classify as a high fidelity source. Our team likes to use the Admiralty rating or the NATO rating. So we classify indicators as high, medium, or low confidence based on their sourcing. So and there's a lot of Intel feeds out there. I'm not going to name names, but there are some that don't do a really good job of validating the information as they come in. They take it from people who are issuing with the assumption that they've already done the validation. But in a panic situation, things get submitted that are not necessarily a part of the compromise. I cannot tell you how many times I've seen Outlook.com or Google.com pop up as a malicious command and control module, and all of a sudden people can't get to the internet because their DNS is routed through google.com and it was flagged as malicious. through a particular feed. So you've got to be really careful about where that threat intelligence is coming from and how it's validated inside of the environment. But
Yeah.
IOC, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so you bring up a very good point. So threat intelligence, like much of the information we get, is, so words have meaning, particularly in what we do. So a lot of times we'll use the words such as, I just call that information. But is Outlook.com actually a threat? Debates on that aside, it's not. So when we get these inputs, they are data points. So putting together the intelligence is work that security operations has to do to have it make sense contextually to your organization. So back to you, Bryan.
And something that I think we've kind of glossed over and we lose track of in security organizations is our job is not to make an organization secure. Our job is to reduce risk to a manageable degree. So in doing that, we have to assess three things. We have to assess the risk, the vulnerability, and all of that pulls together to equal out to the threat. So an IOC gives us a potential risk, but we have to assess that risk against any potential vulnerability of exploitation against the organization, and by that determine the threat level of it. In the case of something like Outlook or Google, while there is a potential risk, by disrupting that, how much business disruption are we going to cause? And in that way, are we introducing new risk to the organization, not necessarily security risk, but business risk? Are we now reducing the business's capability to function at an optimal level and be able to perform what it's designed to perform? By shutting down, a case in point, I've worked with hospitals, and a lot of them have end-of-life operating systems running in their organization, operating things like MRI machines. But if we block those systems off and we kill them because they are end of life, we are actually introducing additional risk by cutting off a massive diagnostic tool that they have to have. And there's no way to update those systems because the manufacturers don't support it. And these are multi-million-dollar systems. So we have to be able to balance risk, operability, and business function to make sure that we are not becoming a problem and we are not actually introducing business risk by trying to reduce security risk. And IOCs have a great capability to get a foot in the door for threat hunting and to get proactive. But they also introduce that extra risk of potentially, without validation, causing some problems. So by pulling in these IOCs, it allows you to assess what type of logs, what kind of visibility do we need in order to assess this. And it allows us to get proactive versus reactive. So we can start looking for IOCs before they're there. But that gives us a chance to scope out where our detections lie. It helps us to identify what sources we're pulling data in from and what their level of reliability is and how much risk we're willing to accept as a security organization versus how much could this potentially introduce to the larger business. But all of this brings in and it allows the incident response team to confirm, like IOCs, the one benefit is on a high fidelity IOC, it's a canary. If something is going on with those IOCs and you know for a fact, you know, this is a hash belonging to Carbonac or Metasploit, and there is no active pen test, you know for a fact something malicious is happening. And that gives you a very high fidelity signal. Go ahead.
Yeah, so real quickly, so Bryan mentioned the canary. So speaking of idiomatic expressions, so the canary in the coal mine. So the miners would place a canary at the front of the mine. So if there were noxious fumes, you know, the canary falls over as a former canary, and the miners know to get out. So just for clarity there. So, you know, and actually real quick, you were talking about, you know, so in the medical field and really in the entirety of the operational technology space for industrial controls, you have that all the time with, well, yeah, it may be Windows 2003, but we can't make this life-saving pharmaceutical. So it's all about contextualizing what you do. And that was one thing back when before cybersecurity was called cybersecurity, a major component of it was called information assurance. It wasn't just saying yes or no to you could do something, it was assuring, or it should have been assuring aspects of, you know, what would be called or fall under the CIA triad. Now, of course, talking about the CIA triad is definitely outside of scope for the time we have. So that being said, Bryan, is there anything else on IOCs you want to discuss before we get into the hypothesis aspect?
No, I think it definitely opens us up, the canary discussion, to, you know, a larger discussion on active defense and
Yeah.
what you can do as a defender to be proactively disrupting and annoying to adversarial activity. But that is also outside of the scope of this, but it's also a very fun conversation.
Yeah, and as we go into the last major methodology, one thing to keep in mind is there are three here, and they are tools, or they are sets of tools, systems for us as defenders to be able to utilize. They are not a always, sometimes, never, right? So even if you have a very robust Tahiti-based threat program and you're doing a lot of automations, you have fantastic run books and playbooks, you're doing detections as code and a CI/CD pipeline, there are going to be times where you want to do hypothesis-based work, or you want to do IOC-based work. So just things to keep in mind as we're going through this. And let us go hypothesize about this, Bryan. What would you like to cover on this one?
So the thing that we often don't think about, you know, a lot of us are nerds. I am chief among them. In the middle of a morning meeting this morning, somebody said that we were security Jedi, and I may or may not have pulled out a lightsaber. We're not going to talk about how many I have, because I have, but I love space. I love chemistry. I love exploring the world around me. But we don't often think about, you know, information security and defense operations as a scientific method. So for those that are, you know, not sure or are unfamiliar with it, the scientific method is observe or ask a question, make an observation, ask a question, research your topic area, create a hypothesis, test with experimentation, analyze data, and report your conclusions. And then it cycles back onto those observations and questions. So a hypothesis-based system is very similar to a Tahiti methodology. And honestly, IOC, hypothesis, and Tahiti, there's a massive amount of overlap between them.
Yeah.
And each one generates additional data points. And if you can integrate the three together, you've got a really, really potent recipe for an extremely effective threat hunting and intelligence program. But a hypothesis-based system starts out just like the scientific method. You begin with a specific hypothesis or theory based about the potential threat, structured around existing knowledge. So that's, again, pulling from those intelligence sources, pulling from high fidelity sources. There are several out there that are absolutely fantastic, and there are some that are a little bit more uncertain. Now, the only catch is really good hypothesis building comes from really well-established data. You can only do, you know, a friend of mine once told me, make your assessment and then show me the data. If the data does not back the assessment, or if the data is unreliable, your assessment is not going to be accurate. So based on that, we can take and assess what we're bringing in And unfortunately, sometimes that's going to be slower. Really great sources of information to build hypothesis-based data off of are going to be things like the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, CISA, alert recommendations. Those are extremely high fidelity, but they're a little bit slower. They're much better than they used to be. There was a time when, you know, you would get a 6-month lag between the release of exploitation from an actor and the incident response and handling, and the release of governmental recommendations and guidance, at which point the actor had completely changed tactics. But now we're looking at, you know, just a week to 3 weeks turnaround. So it's much, much better than it used to be. But these are very, very high fidelity sources. And you can narrow your scope based on the data that is now being fed in for your hypothesis. So just like in Tahiti, we were talking about how you can inform your incident response by knowing what the next actions that a threat actor is going to make. You can help inform your hypothesis to be a cleaner scope and focus on targeted threats as opposed to a much broader spectrum where it's going to take longer, it's going to take more resources, and it's going to be harder to build on that. Now, the catch to a hypothesis space is a lot of times, because the data is limited coming in, it can be kind of scattershot, and it can be a much greater requirement of resources, time, and expertise. So one of the things that we really like to do, Randy and I, is we've got a team of threat hunters. Every analyst on our team, every engineer, every person on our team is a threat hunter. But we have specific individuals that are designated with specializations in various technologies or various techniques. And those people are kind of our go-tos when we hit hypothesis base. So they begin to build on those structures and they feed them back to the analysts who may be a little bit less familiar with the technology, but it helps create a recycling effect. So the expertise that we've developed over here is now recycling to the new analyst, and they're helping to mentor each other. So ultimately, everything moves in a cycle inside of a security operations organization, or at least it should, in my opinion. But
Yeah, you know, and it's a, you know, bringing up the scientific method, Brian, and this is a very important skill to have for really any defender, is to have a really analytical mind and a thought process. So ask a question, find an answer, ask a better question, and you iterate on it. So, you know, and you're going through and describing how we do like to do our hunting. You know, one of the things as you build out an organization, this is where you can start to get some of the rewards from having a team that's composed of diverse backgrounds, diverse thoughts and opinions. You know, and you get that with the hard technical skills as well. But as is the case with skills, those can be taught. It's all of these other skills and attributes. Some of them are soft skills that they really come into play here, and they can really help the organization. So if you're, you know, if you're an individual contributor in the SOC, there are ways you can help. If you're a leader in the SOC, you know, you can see this is how you want to build and really grow and curate your team. So just pieces to keep in mind there.
well, and on that note, I mean, our team is composed of incredibly diverse people. We've got a theater major who, you know, the charisma and the ability to communicate is spectacular. You know, he doesn't have the deep technical knowledge, but this individual's got a great aptitude for being able to ask questions and to help work out guidance and work out our communication and mentorship methods. We've got another person who has an incredible level of technical expertise. We've got people who have worked as first responders in a physical sense. One of the best people I've ever seen in my life as an analyst was a former adjunct professor of psychology. So the thing that we look for when we look at an analyst is not necessarily deep technical skills. It's the
Yeah.
ability to ask good questions and that curiosity to solve puzzles, because that's what you really need in this field. You know, a good technician might take 6 to 12 months to train them as a good investigator, but a good investigator can take just maybe 2 to 3 weeks to become a decent technologist, but a top shelf analyst. And that's what you're looking for with things like the hypothesis-based methodology. You want somebody who can have that intuition and expertise in formulating those hypotheses, not necessarily around the technology, but around patterns, because that's what this is about. You know, my wife made fun of me because I played Sudoku, and then she got into it and she looked over at me last night and she said, "I really hate that you got me into this. I can't stop." But it's that investigative mindset and that curiosity helps to build those structures. And when we do an analysis 101 course with new team members, that's the core that it goes through, is building good questions, asking good questions. What are the core, I'm trying to think of the word for it. Not necessarily metaphysical, but the philosophical underpinnings. You know, understanding logic and reasoning and creative thinking and being able to assess their own biases. So those help to formulate that expertise in building a good hypothesis. Again, you don't have to be a world-class technologist to be a top flight analyst. You just have to be able to ask good questions.
Absolutely, Brian. So let's start to tie some of this together. So Brian mentioned, and we've talked about risks. That is primary function that we have to perform in cybersecurity. And there's different aspects of that, right? So regardless of what we are working on, you know, and trying to do, building out an understanding of scope of what you're trying to do is very important. You know, don't try to do it all at once, especially since we don't know what it all is. So being able to have a path, be able to iterate on that is very important. So that's where agile methodologies are useful to come in. What's a minimum viable capability, potentially a minimum viable product to be able to do this, right? So, you know, and as far as how to characterize this, there are frameworks for it as well. So as far as Verus is very good for event and incident recording and sharing. And of course, everyone has heard about the MITRE attack matrix, and some have heard about the defend matrix. So those are very useful. And, you know, some of the history of the attack matrix, you know, MITRE is an organization, you know, 11, 12 years ago, they're doing red team work in a customer environment, and they are doing blue team type of work in the environment, and they needed to be able to share between their MITRE teams. So you see where this is useful inside of your organization. So on those, Brian, is there anything in particular you'd like to pick out as key points to bring up?
Yeah, the big thing with the MITRE attack and defend matrix and Verus is communication. It's the ability to communicate between organizations and understand what's happening. But understanding organizational risk really comes down to the scope. You know, I live, for instance, in central North Carolina. So are earthquakes a problem here? Well, it's a remote consideration because there are some fault lines, but they're very, very inactive. So do I need to worry, you know, is it a high level risk that my house be affected by an earthquake? Truthfully, no. There have been some minor ones, but nothing above like a 2. So it might rattle some of the glasses in a cabinet. But in a place like, say, Indonesia, is that something that needs to be considered? Absolutely, because you're then on the ring of fire in the Pacific, which is geologically incredibly unstable. So their risk factors are going to be different than mine. In the same way, a finance organization is going to have a very different set of risk factors than, say, a hospital. So understanding your organization and understanding what risks you face will help you to scope that intelligence gathering and that hunting methodology. And part of the way that we do that is like what Randy was talking about, checking the Verus data, which is where Verizon actually piloted, and they're bringing the data in for the Verizon Data Breach and Investigation Report, which they release every year. And it shows the information about the various publicly reported breaches that have gone through this system, and it can inform you about what other organizations like yours are facing. But we'll talk a little bit more about the profiling in the next slide.
All right. What is a profile, or as I love to call a dossier, Brian?
You can always tell that Randy's got the deep military background, and I've got that old, Southern country boy background.
Hey, I'm the Southern country boy farmhand that went to work for the military.
Well, that's the only reason that we can communicate. I think
that's right.
It's the only reason we understand each other. But a threat model is built around assessing the core business of an organization to help define that scope. You start with your NAICS codes for companies that are registered and doing business in North America. Look at your crown jewel assessments. You want to understand what is the core industry vertical that you are in, because a lot of threat actor groups are classified based on what their targeting is. You also want to go through, and I'm not going to go really in depth with these, but you want to be able to assess what is the IP range that your company hosts. What are the technologies that are on your perimeter? There have been a number of times that I've gone through and I've done a dossier with Randy, and we've gone to a meeting with a customer and said, okay, based on our assessment, these are your core risks. And their eyes got really big and they were like, I didn't even know we had that IP range, that it even belonged to us. But sure enough, it was anchored to their core domain. So being able to have that is going to really assess that information. You want to know what industry vertical you're in, who your high value targets are, board members, executive boards, people that can make financial decisions that are likely to be targeted by business email compromise and social engineering. You also want to understand your infrastructure. And that's not just what's publicly available on reported tools and scans. That can be stuff that gets exposed via job postings. But you also want to take a look at potential bit squats of common domains and login pages. But social media sentiment can tell you a lot about who's potentially targeting your organization. Does someone have an axe to grind with you? Have you made someone upset recently, and now this organization is out to really hurt your company? And all of that pulls together and it creates your threat intelligence profile, which can tell you the threat actors targeting you, reported incidents, which would be your Verus information, existing countermeasures and defenses, and the imminent risks that need to be addressed by your organization and which ones are already addressed, which you can perform through an audit. But the threat actor profiling is pretty interesting as well, and we'll hit that in the next one.
So, and real quick before we go into that, as we approach the end of our discussion, it's important to get an understanding of like and kind and similar TTPs, not to identify specific actors. There are diminishing returns in your ability to do that, and we'll briefly touch on the life cycle and how you employ the OODA loop: observe, orient, decide, and act in a rapid process, because you don't want to spend 4 days working on finding out who the actor is meanwhile they're rampaging through your network, right? So any points you want to bring up in here as far as the profile points on disambiguation or infrastructure capability, Brian?
So I wanted to kind of reiterate what you said. I talk a lot about threat actor modeling and profiling. The thing is, I never tell a customer which threat actor is targeting them, because the truth is, I don't know. But having that resource and that understanding of what a common threat action is based on specific patterns, it allows me to make good predictive analysis of what the actor is going to do next. Ultimately, unless you are a law enforcement agency or you have the ability to issue sanctions, really there's nothing that an organization can do with the knowledge that it is being attacked by a specific threat actor. All it
Yeah.
does is it helps us to inform our understanding of what the next most likely actions are going to be. So we're not firing blind into the darkness, trying to figure out what's coming. We now have some idea of what the most likely next steps are. The things that I really like is we use the diamond model of intrusion analysis. So we look at the capabilities, the adversary identification, is not necessarily the threat actor involved. It's things like IP addresses, host names, domains. What kind of identifiers does this threat actor present so that we can track them back and we can make sure that we are tracking what they're doing to inform our analysis later on, which feeds back into intelligence, which we'll talk about in just a second. But we really want to look at their capabilities and their infrastructure so that we're able to identify specific patterns, and that will help us to track it to other organizations and other intelligence sources and make us more efficient and effective at predicting the next phase of the attack.
Thank you, Bryan. So let's briefly pull it back together on how do you develop a use case for doing this?
So really rushing through this because we are a bit short on time. Ultimately, the use case development life cycle starts out with the informing of a crown jewel assessment or the threat model or dossier. You look at your various reported incidents, you look at the threat actors targeting an industry vertical, and you track out what their tools are. All of this leads to intelligence-driven analysis, use case development, and threat hunting. So again, the cycle completes. And if you've got a red team or penetration testing team attached to your company and to your organization, what you can do is you can now have them cycle it back and double test to make sure that your new use cases and your new searches and defenses are actually going to hold against the techniques you expect to see. So you're no longer trying to destroy the entire MITRE attack matrix. You now are focused on the highest probability targeting.
And you want to be able to do that rapidly. You don't want to go through 72 steps. Meanwhile, the bad guys laterally moved a dozen times through your environment, right? So, how do you employ OODA, right? You'll see a lot of concepts discussed when you do internet searches. Well, use OODA loop. What does that mean? Well, as you go through an incident response, intelligence-driven life cycle, you have to start with an incident response process often. How do you incorporate threat intel? And do you do threat hunting? Is it automated or is it manual or some combination? And how can you validate that, verify it, and ultimately feed it back into an analysis project or a process, and then update and tune your detection engineering, right? You get out of the box from your EDR vendor, your MDR vendor. How do you improve that and make it more contextually relevant to your environment? So anything on the life cycle, Bryan, you want to touch on?
No, everything really starts with observation, being detailed and seeing what is actually happening and making sure that you understand your own environment as well as what the potential threats are. That observation allows you a faster, cleaner, and more efficient orientation, which makes for better, more informed decisions, which makes for more decisive and effective action, which leads back to better observations. So all of this feeds itself.
And you have to be wary of the trap that many fall into of, we think we're going to do OODA, but you forget to orient and decide. You just go from observe to act. So don't fall into that trap either. Don't fall into that trap, and don't fall into analysis paralysis and don't act. So as with everything else, there's pragmatism involved in making those decision cycles. So, doing things in an automated fashion, SOAR, has been some of the zeitgeist in recent years on what we do, and really what we've done for over 20 years. I mean, to be clear. So things that are new and able to enrich it more are doing language model processing, AI. To be able, how can we use good standards and techniques? And if you're in an MSSP environment such as we are at Syntax, we have different technologies, different processes. So we want to do detection as code pipeline work using Sigma. That way we can go to multiple vendor MDR tools, for example, or laughs or what have you. And of course, Yara, we want to be able to use as much as possible. So anything you want to add to this, Bryan?
Just that a lot of these technologies that are coming out are really, really cool. We're getting to play with large language models on my team, and we're assessing their capability. Now, we've got a larger organization. We're able to host our own. So we can use one that is entirely native to our environment and data can't escape. So there is one thing that I would say is, as you're playing with these models, make sure that you are doing a good job of sanitizing your data, because leaked information through a large language model could potentially be detrimental and can introduce more of those organizational risks that we were talking about. I can't tell you how many times I've seen somebody upload, a quarterly business report a month early to Virus Total on accident, and they completely DOSed their entire business meeting. So be smart, be careful, and be aware.
Yeah, absolutely. Great points. And all I could think of as you were talking was Virus Total. So I feel validated there. And things to think of as you're building out a catalog. You want, regardless if you're building out a automation catalog or it's just general ops procedures, you want consistency and repeatability. We deal with enough reactive componentry, enough chaos in our day-to-day roles. That's part of why we do this, part of why we're there, right? So as you're putting together playbooks, the collection of what we want to do, smartly go and build out the more discrete, dare I say, more atomic level run books and then you put them together. That way you don't have to make everything fresh for every new playbook. So just be methodical to a point, but be very thoughtful in how you do it. You have a purpose and an intent. Go into it intentionally. Don't go into it as an accident. You have the opportunity to organize, and if you don't measure it, you can't manage it. So as a leader in the organization, you need to be able to have objectives and key results, OKRs, for your organization. Yes, we do firefighting and operations. That comes with the territory, but you need to have goals and objectives for your team and your team's capability, your products, if you're in the MSSP space, and how do you work with your customers from there, or how do you work with your internal organization? You have high level, service level agreements, and a lot of people tend to stop at SLAs. But if you're into that and you write them and you have to manage them, you want to really get down into objectives and indicators. So the indicators are often overlooked. Those are your atomic level pieces, and you want to roll them up into objectives. And all of those will meet, or the idea is they meet your higher level, less detailed service level agreements. And as with our roles as cybersecurity specialists, professionals, there's always further research. So these are some good suggestions. There are many more. I think the CIS top 6 will always be at the top of mine and probably Bryan's. You see all of, when you search and you see things looking for how do I combat ransomware, most of the articles you see are terrible. In the Google results, at least how Google characterizes and gives me mine. So it's a constant struggle, a challenge for any organization, whether it's 5 associates or 500,000, having worked with both extremes, to keep your top 6 CIS, not the top 18, just get the top 6 to start with, to deal with your BEC, to deal with your ransomware, to deal with your wire and invoice fraud. Yes, the others help, but those are the foundational pieces, and the frameworks as well, just as reference. Any part you want to add to that, Bryan, before we give it back to Shilpa?
No, I think we're a little bit shy on time, but I definitely want to give everybody a chance to ask some questions. So
All right.
hand it back to you,
Oh,
Shilpa.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Randy and Bryan, for an informative session, and our attendees share the same sentiments. Now, before we begin with the Q&A, I would like to inform all the attendees that this session is in sync with the EC Council CTIA program. EC Council CTIA maps to many roles in the industries like threat intelligence analyst, threat analysis and reporting, vulnerability management and threat intelligence engineer, etc. Anyone with the CTIA certification is eligible for 9,000 plus job vacancies globally with an average salary of $100,000 and $324. If you're interested to know more, kindly take part in the poll that's going to be conducted now. Let us know your preferred mode of training and we will reach out to you soon. Shall we start with the Q&A?
Sounds great.
excellent.
Okay. Our first question is, how can machine learning help detect threats in real time? Can you suggest some data sets for testing the effectiveness of algorithms and suitable for features? By Kamran Mohsin.
Hmm.
So,
You
I'll
can go for it.
start on. Machine learning can be very effective, especially if, like we were saying, if you've got good, reliable data sets, you're going to be able to feed that learning algorithm an appropriate level of information. I prefer, honestly, to use the machine learning systems to issue a, I'm trying to remember how we phrased it. We use machine learning more to give a triage validation as well as a malicious rating. So based on the number of indicators, based on what it's seeing as a pattern, it will issue a high, medium, or low confidence rating of malicious activity based off of the reliability of the data sources, based off of the number of tags on those data sources. So it can be very effective, but I can't think of a specific model off the top of my head that I would say is the best one for this.
Yeah. Well, and as you come up with a model, one thing you have to always keep in mind is that it has to be continually tuned by personnel. So just from a resourcing standpoint, something to keep in mind there.
And if you're looking for a very entry-level data set to start with, take a look at Splunk's Boss of the SOC. They've got a lot of very high fidelity indicators that are built into that system. So you can start to use that as your tuning model. And that's where I usually point analysts to get their teeth cut in on fundamentals of analysis and threat intelligence.
Yeah. Back to you, Shilpa.
Thank you for answering that question. Our next question is, what strategies can organizations employ to effectively manage the issue of normalization challenges in IOC-based threat intelligence, especially considering the complexity arising from different formats and standards used by various sources?
Great question. I'll start on this one, Bryan. So, Bryan and I come from different backgrounds, and when we started working together years ago, we immediately found out we had similar thoughts on it. So putting together the dossier, that profile, so a major component of that is that crown jewel analysis. So what's a crown jewel? So if you're a normal commercial organization, you're going to be targeted probably by BEC, so business email compromise, invoice and wire fraud, typically via BEC. and the normal password spray, credential stuffing, ransomware, et cetera, et cetera. So it's important when you put together your crown jewels that, one, you do it rapidly to start with. You can always go back and add to it, but what's important? So finance department, accounts payable, your CFO, not just your IDAS and your WAF and your IDAM, right? Those probably are as well. So those are good places to start, because you need to take those IOCs and really contextualize them. You know, how we talked about earlier, don't focus so much on its FIN 8 or APT 37 or what have you. Focus on what's happening in your market verticals. So when Bryan was talking through looking up your NAICS codes, what markets do you operate in as a company, right? And then do you outsource things to other companies? And it can be useful, and I would recommend it as well, to look at what your supply chain looks like, because if you're outsourcing your finance department, right, you now have a supply chain issue, not just an internal issue with wire and invoice fraud. So, Bryan, anything you would like to add to this? We could talk about this for days.
Absolutely. A lot of and with specific IOCs, ingesting them, it's going to be entirely dependent on how you bring them in. Most good feeds now are normalized. So I know sometimes it just takes a common information model assessment and audit of the system. But personally, our team uses Sigma specifically because it is a fairly universal setup and it's fairly easy to deploy in a training capacity to get people to start ingesting the data. But most sticks and taxi feeds have a normalization model built into them, which will allow you to ingest that. If you've got the time and the capability and you're getting data that is unstructured, that would be a good opportunity for you to do some work with a large language model, something like a fork of ChatGPT that you're hosting internally, to feed that data set into. That's something that we're testing right now, is potentially bringing a bunch of unstructured data from a lot of different feeds, specifically news articles, and having it turn that into actionable IOCs based off of a common information model. We're still working on the training on that, but it's getting there. But those are some opportunities to kind of expand into a heavier automation. But I would definitely take a look at what is a good common information model. And in most cases, your SIM is also going to have the ability to normalize that data as it brings it in. Splunk has TAs. I know Sentinel has got some connectors that it will actually bring the data in and it'll normalize it for you. So I hope that helps.
Thank you for answering that question. We'll take last two questions for the day. Next question is, any antivirus software expected with AI?
I guess my question on that one is, with the antivirus software expected with AI, are we talking about antivirus that is expected to be able to detect AI activity, or one that is actually going to integrate AI into it? Because if it's the latter, a lot of the modern systems, especially the heavier duty EDRs like CrowdStrike, already integrate a heavy component of machine learning algorithms into it. A good chunk of their detections and their intelligence is fed off of that, which is really, really effective. Sometimes it could be a little bit noisy, especially if an organization has a little bit more of a particular environment. There are some cases that you're going to have indicators and observables get flagged that are not necessarily malicious, but they're behaving in a potentially malicious way, but it's entirely expected. Good case in point, we had a detection earlier this week that we were certain was malicious. The AI, or the machine learning algorithm in the EDR, recognized it as malicious. We looked through and we're like, yes, this is bad. And it turned out that it was just a little bit of a quirk in a specific piece of code that was developed as a completely proprietary application for this organization. And it took us a little bit of time and some incident response and a big bridge call to figure out exactly what had happened.
Mhm. So you're always going to be working on context. And as an organization with defense, whether you're ops or engineering, as you build your own language model, you have to be able to take your EDR, MDR, vendor feed, even if they're doing ML and AI work, you have to contextualize it, right? Just because it's a low score. Take, for example, 7 weeks ago with VMware tools, it was a low criticality score, but contextually based upon your environment, in our case, particular customer environments, that could be a higher level criticality score, and it very much was. So you really have to take that as a contextual case by case basis in some cases. So great question.
Thank you for answering that question. Our last question is, need more explanation or resource for attack matrix by Amelia.
So the MITRE attack matrix is a breakdown of the fundamental tactics and processes used by threat actors inside of an organization. It's a common communication method for explaining how an actor is moving through an environment and what tactics they are using in order to exploit the environment. MITRE itself has released a lot of really great processes on it, and a cursory Google would get you some really good ones. The one that I like to point people toward is actually attack.mitre, and MITRE is spelled mitre.org/resources/getting-started. And they've got an ebook, they've got some blog posts and blog series, as well as a small framework explanation video to really get you diving in on it. It's a great tool to get started with, to be able to assess what your defenses are actually working towards and covering, as well as what is actually happening out in the world.
Yeah, and a good way to use it to visualize in your mind is later looking at the attack matrix. If you go through and do a quick dossier on your organization and what kind of attacker methods, TTPs are used, you would click through certain pieces in that matrix, and it would highlight them, right? So those would be the ones you would focus on. That way you could take, everyone has limited resources. You could actually take limited resources and you could see visually what areas to focus on and then drill down from there. So that helps you actually put it to use. Otherwise the attack matrix is like, what do I do with this? That is a use case to use it. Great question.
Thank you again to our wonderful speaker, Randy and Bryan, for answering those questions and for the great presentation and the knowledge shared to our global audiences. It was a pleasure to have you with us, and we are looking forward to more and more sessions with you. Before we conclude the webinar, would you like to give a small message to our audiences, please?
Thank everyone for asking the questions, for being here with us in our conversation on our threat and intel topic today.
Thank you all very much. And remember that the thing that's going to secure your environment and disrupt adversaries is going to be you. Make a determination of what you want to accomplish and what impact you want to have, and start moving toward it. Guarantee you, it's going to be the most effective way to go.
Nicely said. Thank you
so
EC Council.
Thank you so much for the message to our audiences. Now, before we end the session, I would like to announce our next Cyber Talk session, Artificial Intelligence Primer, Risk Management and Compliance Consideration, which is scheduled for September 11, 2023. This session is an expert presentation by Merlin Viom, independent cybersecurity consultant and advisor of Web3 and decentralized technologies. To register for this session, please do go and visit our website www.ecouncil.org/cybersecurity-exchange/cybertalks. The link is given in the chat section. Hope to see you all on September 11th. With this, we end the session. You may now disconnect your lines. Thank you. Thank you so much, Randy and Bryan. Pleasure having you here. Bye-bye.
Thank you.